If you grew up in the late 60s, the 70s, or into the early 80s, there's a specific kind of memory that probably lives somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The smell of Saturday morning cereal.
Correct. I can't do any dirty work from that.
The particular quality of light through curtains that hadn't been opened yet. The sound of a television warming up in a quiet house before anyone else was awake. And if you were sitting in front of that television on a Saturday morning, there's a good chance Wacky Races was part of what you remember. 11 cars, dozens of characters, explosions and contraptions, and a snickering dog who somehow became one of the most beloved figures in animation history. The show had that quality, that permanent, unshakable Saturday morning quality where you assumed it was just always going to be there. But when you actually look at the numbers, something doesn't add up. Because Wacky Races, this massive, cultural, cereal box institution of a cartoon, only produced 17 episodes. For something that felt that big, that embedded, that generational, 17 episodes seems almost impossible. And the question most fans never think to ask is a simple one. Why did it stop? The easy answer is production costs. But that's not really the answer. The real reason Hanna-Barbera stopped making Wacky Races is more interesting than most people realize, and it says something surprising about how the television business worked in that era that none of us, as kids, had any reason to understand. There's also something else worth knowing about how this show came to exist at all, something that happened before a single frame was drawn. In a meeting about a completely different kind of entertainment, that almost meant Wacky Races never became a cartoon in the first place. We'll get there.
And I didn't bring my shower.
If you've been coming back to these cartoons lately, revisiting the shows that shaped those Saturday mornings, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There's a lot more from this era worth revisiting together, and these stories are better experienced as a conversation than a solitary late-night rabbit hole. But before we understand why it ended, we need to go back to where it all began. The year is 1968, and Saturday morning television has become, quietly and without much fanfare from the adult world, one of the most commercially significant programming blocks in American broadcasting. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera understood this better than almost anyone. By the mid-60s, their studio had already built an empire on the back of limited animation, a technique that allowed them to produce cartoons faster and cheaper than the traditional Disney method by reusing background cycles, simplifying character movement, and keeping scenes visually contained. At their peak, Hanna-Barbera was responsible for producing nearly 2/3 of all Saturday morning cartoon content, which means the landscape that defined a generation of childhoods was, in a very real sense, a Hanna-Barbera product. So when they decided to build a new show around an ensemble cast of racing characters, they weren't guessing. The creative inspiration traces back to a 1965 slapstick comedy film called The Great Race. A broad, theatrical, gloriously silly movie about a cross-country automobile race filled with scheming villains, bumbling heroes, and spectacular failures. You can feel that film's DNA in nearly every frame of Wacky Races. The same anarchic energy, the same obsessive focus on a villain who can never quite win. But what Hanna-Barbera brought to that concept was scale, repetition, and the particular genius of the ensemble format. 11 cars, 23 characters, total counting passengers and animal companions, each episode split into 2 separate 10-minute races, giving you a complete comedic arc twice in a single sitting. The structure was clean, efficient, and endlessly repeatable, which, as we'll come to understand, was the entire point. The show premiered on CBS on September 14, 1968, and from the very first episode, audiences understood the basic rhythm of it intuitively, the way you understand a good joke format before you've even heard the punchline. There would be a race. Something would go wrong. Dick Dastardly would cheat, and Dick Dastardly would lose.
Oh, it's y'all again. Dear me, you look as...
Here's something worth thinking about. The character who probably made the show famous was designed, from the very beginning, to fail. Dick Dastardly, voiced with magnificent pomposity by Paul Winchell, drives car number 0 to 0, the Mean Machine, a vehicle so thoroughly over-engineered for sabotage that it carries missiles, drills, traps, and elaborate mechanical contraptions. capable of doing almost anything except, apparently, winning a race. He is brilliant, theatrical, and capable of extraordinary creativity when it comes to undermining his opponents. And he loses every single time, not because he's incompetent, but because the show understood something almost philosophically interesting about the nature of villainy. The more elaborate the scheme, the more spectacular the failure. His genius was always in service of his own undoing. That was a deliberate tonal choice, and it separated Wacky Races from more traditional cartoon conflict. Dastardly wasn't scary or threatening. He was a figure of sympathetic absurdity, a man who worked harder than anyone else in the race and was rewarded for it with humiliation. Children loved him for exactly that reason, and if you remember feeling a strange, conflicted fondness for a cartoon villain as a kid, you were picking up on something the writers put there intentionally. And then there was Muttley. Voiced by Don Messick, Muttley is arguably the most purely comedic character in the entire Hanna-Barbera catalog, and that's a very competitive list. He doesn't speak. He snickers that wheezing, gasping, barely contained laugh that has become so iconic it exists as cultural shorthand for a very specific kind of gleeful, helpless amusement. His relationship with Dastardly is the emotional engine of the show. He serves his boss, suffers for his boss, snickers at his boss's failures, sometimes directly to his face, and then braces for the inevitable punishment. Through all of it, he remains undeniably lovable, a creature of pure reaction, holding up a mirror to the absurdity of everything around him. If you remember Muttley more vividly than almost any other character from this era, you're not alone in that. The rest of the cast carried their own weight too. Penelope Pitstop, voiced by Janet Waldo, brought warmth and gentle comedy to the show from behind the wheel of her pink compact pussycat. Peter Perfect, the Slag Brothers, the Gruesome Twosome, the Ant Hill Mob. Each car had its own comedic identity, its own visual language, its own running joke that children could anticipate and adults could appreciate. The show trusted its audience to remember, and that's rarer than it sounds in children's television.
Dear me, you look aside. You could be attractive.
We're now about halfway through this story, and this is a good moment to return to the question that opened it because most people, when they think about why Wacky Races ended after 17 episodes, assume it failed. Low ratings, poor reception, some executive somewhere pulling a plug. But the real reason it stopped isn't what most fans think. The show was, by the standards of the time, a genuine success. Strong ratings, strong audience response, children and families watching, merchandise selling. So, why did production stop where it did? The answer lies in a business strategy that Hanna-Barbera had essentially perfected, and that defined the economics of Saturday morning animation in ways viewers simply had no reason to think about as kids. 17 episodes, or thereabouts, was considered the ideal syndication package. Not too short to be worth purchasing for local broadcast, but not so long that reruns would feel exhausted before the cycle could repeat. When you had 17 episodes, you could sell that package to stations who would run them, and run them again, filling Saturday morning slots for years, without requiring new production. It was, in other words, a feature built into the plan from the beginning, not a sign that something had gone wrong. Hanna-Barbera had deliberately built a machine designed to run on minimal fuel. The limited animation style meant backgrounds could be recycled, vehicle designs reused, character movement cycles carried across episode after episode with minimal adjustment. But animating 11 uniquely designed vehicles per episode, even with heavy recycling, was genuinely demanding work, and once you reached the point where a syndication package was complete and profitable, there was no economic incentive to keep producing. The show didn't end because it failed. It ended because it had done exactly what it was built to do.
Little Gruesome is shifting into storm power.
Which brings us back to that strange detail from the beginning, the thing that happened before a single frame was drawn. Because before Wacky Races became an animated cartoon, the original concept was something else entirely. The early pitch involved a live-action game show format, with a betting element, viewers or participants wagering on race outcomes. CBS rejected it. Their concern was gambling, which was considered inappropriate for a broadcast environment aimed at children, and so the concept was retooled, and the game show elements were stripped away. But here's what most people never noticed. traces of that original concept remained visible in the credits for years after the show aired. The Heater Quigley Productions credit a company known specifically for game show production sat quietly at the end of each episode, a remnant of the version of Wacky Races that never quite made it to air. There's another layer to the origin story that reshapes how you think about the characters themselves. Some of the racers were not designed for the screen first. They were, at least in part, reverse-engineered from toy designs already in development for the 1968 Christmas market, meaning the characters needed to exist as physical products before the show even finished production. What this tells you is that Wacky Races was commercial in its DNA in a way that even a cynical observer might not have fully appreciated, not just a cartoon with merchandise attached, but a merchandise ecosystem that happened to include a cartoon. And that merchandise performed, with toy sales estimated at around $40 million, a figure that comfortably outpaced what the show's ratings alone would have justified. The show ran its original CBS broadcast from September 1968 through January 1969, with reruns continuing through 1970. Then, beginning in 1976, it entered a new phase of syndication that would last until approximately 1982. Those 17 episodes cycling through local broadcast markets, appearing on Saturday mornings and weekday afternoons, finding entirely new audiences who experienced the show as something fresh. If you grew up in the mid-70s or early 80s and remember Wacky Races as a childhood staple, you were almost certainly watching reruns. And the remarkable thing is that it didn't feel that way. It felt like a show that was simply always there. That sense of permanence, that feeling that Wacky Races was a fixture rather than a briefly produced artifact of 1968, was an optical illusion created by the syndication strategy 17 episodes cycling endlessly, giving the show a presence far larger than its actual production run could logically justify. The show felt bigger than it really was, and now you know why. As for its legacy, that may be the most interesting chapter of all, because Wacky Races didn't just leave behind fond memories, it left behind a structural template. The two spin-offs that followed in 1969, Dastardly and Muttley in Their Flying Machines, which took the central duo into World War I-style aerial comedy, and The Perils of Penelope Pitstop, which gave Penelope and the Ant Hill Mob their own serial adventure, both followed the same 17-episode model. Hanna-Barbera had found a format that worked commercially, and they built the next generation of content on exactly the same foundation. The ensemble racing format itself proved extraordinarily durable, too, with the DNA of Wacky Races showing up in the structure of competitive entertainment for decades, since the idea that a race is more interesting when every competitor has a distinct personality, a running joke, and a predictable but entertaining failure mode. That's a contribution to popular culture that has never really gone away, even if its origin isn't always recognized. A 2017 reboot on Boomerang acknowledged that the original had become something larger than itself, a cultural reference point that new audiences could engage with without necessarily having seen a single episode of the 1968 version. Which brings us back to where we started, Saturday morning. The particular quality of that light, the sound of a cartoon beginning before the rest of the house was awake. If you remember Wacky Races as something enormous, something permanent, something that felt like it had always existed and always would, that feeling was real, even if the reality behind it was 17 episodes, a modest production budget, and a business strategy built around syndication rather than longevity. The show understood something fundamental about what entertainment actually does to people, that what you carry with you is rarely the quantity of something, but the depth of the impression it left. Dick Dastardly never won a race, not once, and yet he remains, more than 50 years later, one of the most recognized animated villains ever created. Muttley never said a word. And that snicker has outlasted 1,000 more articulate characters who came and went without leaving a trace. Wacky Races didn't need 100 episodes. It needed to run long enough to become part of you. And for most of us who found it on those Saturday mornings, it did exactly that. If you enjoy revisiting the cartoons that defined an era, the story of Voltron takes that nostalgia in a completely different direction. A show that arrived in 1984, carrying its own surprising origins. its own unlikely behind-the-scenes decisions, and its own permanent place in the memory of everyone who grew up watching it. That story is worth your time.